highlighted speaker of this lunch session, Jeff Bohanon. He's the founder and president of Protomet. He's a graduate of the University of Tennessee with a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering and a Master's in Industrial Engineering. He worked at the Y-12 nuclear weapons plant for 12 years as an engineer and project manager, overseeing the manufacture of military hardware, supporting projects for the Air Force, Marines, and the Navy's Seawolf submarine program. After a 12-year career at Y-12, in 1997, he founded an innovative company that provides customized solutions for your on-the-water experience. The company now has a 22-year history of continued growth and 3 major facility expansions, providing products to various industries, including automotive, aerospace, and the military. His core business partners with the marine industry OEMs to design and manufacture premium mirrors, racks, and other leading features on today's top towboats. He also happens to be a perennial supporter of this summit. He has some great ideas and a good mindset to share with you guys. So please give a warm summit welcome to Mr. Jeff Bohanon.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Clickers up here. Hey, the pointer. Okay. Thank you, Kevin. I do want to start out by saying I understand that most of these kickoff luncheons are usually the kickoff speaker is going to be some kind of author or a consultant or maybe some kind of well-recognized athlete. And before you jump to the conclusion that Kevin's just on a really tight budget this year, I wanted to share with you that there was a time when I was actually almost an athlete, and it was in 10th grade. And I was in 10th grade health class, and prior to that time I really had never been an athlete. I'd played a little rec league ball, mostly during the second quarter of the game, because there was a rule that you had to put me in the second quarter no matter how bad I was. I got to play that quarter. But we got to 10th grade health class. The teacher walked in. She says, "All right, class, we're going to do a 12-minute run test. And I need everybody in 3 weeks. I need everybody to know that's coming down the pike." Well, I was in class. It was the smallest person in the class. I was out of shape, believe it or not. I was actually chubby at the time. I actually had there was a room full of football jocks. And so I was extremely intimidated. I was pretty backwards in high school, extremely intimidated. And she might as well have just said, "If you think you might be a loser, in 3 weeks, we're going to give you a test, and we're going to remove all doubt." She might as well have said that. So I got home that day, and I decided the only thing I knew to do for 3 weeks, I was going to go start running. Okay? Now, keep in mind, this is 1978. People didn't run in 1978. So I put my shoes on, tennis shoes, I get out and start running. And I literally, and I'm not exaggerating this for the story, I literally made it to the second mailbox, and I had to start walking. And so for 3 weeks solid, every day after school, I went out and I ran a little bit farther. I would call it something between a walk and a jog. I probably wouldn't call it necessarily a jog, but I was able to, at the end of the 3 weeks, I was able to keep going for 12 minutes. Day of the test came. I get out on the track with all my other classmates, all the jocks, and we start running. I notice a kid named Kenny takes off. He's tall and skinny. He takes off in front of everybody. So I just kind of keep my eyes on Kenny. I keep running. I'm kind of in my own world, not really paying attention to what else is going on. But I notice I never catch Kenny, but I realize nobody has passed me. And I'm like, well, I figured she must have started some other people at a different time. The 12 minutes is over. I get to the end of going around the school track. She comes over and she says, "Do you realize you just finished in second place?" And I could not believe it. And she said, "Do you run?" I said, "Well, for 3 weeks I've been running." and so she said, "Well, you should maybe consider being on the track team." So I took that as a great honor. I mean, I literally never considered myself an athlete, certainly never qualified for kind of high school athletics. I know there's a lot of natural athletes in here. Some of you may have a hard time even relating to that, but I would have never thought myself to be a high school athlete. So I went and trained all summer long, came back to be part of the high school track team, started training with the guys. There was 3 guys on our team that could run a mile in less than 4.5 minutes. And so that was pretty unusual for back then. Usually you'd be lucky to have one person. So I lined up at the very first race with those 3 guys on the front of the pack, and I just thought, well, I'll just do what they do. So I took off running, and for about 200 yards ran with those 3 guys. And then one of them looked over to me, and he said, "Bohanon, what are you doing?" And I didn't really have an answer, but I realized why he was asking me that, because it began to implode. And by the time I got to the finish line, they were literally taking the cones up from the finish of the race, which is a little bit disrespectful, but I understand some of them wanted to probably go home. Today I want to talk about, that was a day of dramatic change. The day she came into that health class was a day of dramatic change for me. I actually did continue to run track the rest of that year, and actually I didn't ever win a race, but I got a lot better, and went from being chubby, out of shape, to running 6-12 miles a day. Was a total transformation of my body. And I asked myself, why did I change? Was I transformed by change, or was I transformed by my reaction to change? And our world, we're in a world of increasing change, and that's what I want to talk about today, because this accelerated change is a great opportunity for us, but a lot of people we're all wired to resist change. We have a long history, the human race has a long history of pretty static, pretty minimal change, and I don't think a lot of us don't even realize how recent the dramatic changes have started happening. And I want to just share some slides to illustrate that. If you look at the last 200 years, we have gone from riding a horse at 8 miles an hour, average speed for 20 miles of a horse. I Googled that, which you couldn't do until the late 2000s, up to a jet, which travels average speed of 550 to 600 miles, which, if you do the math between that number and the horse speed, that's about a 70x improvement in travel speeds, which is pretty incredible if you think about it. And in fact, I didn't put rockets on here because most people don't fly around in rockets, but we've actually got rocket technology. But to that point, a lot of people in my grandparents' generation, there's a high percentage of those people that do not believe we actually went to the moon. And the reason they don't is because they started their childhood on horses, and they ended up seeing on TV us being on the moon. That is so much change in a lifetime that some people have their hard time getting their head around it. To just give that some perspective, if you go back 5,000 years, we've been on a horse for 5,000 years, and literally 200 years ago, we got off the horse. Pretty incredible when you think about the history of our modern world and what we've seen in the last 200 years. So 200 versus 4,800. I came across this concept as I was researching the talk about change. There's a guy named Peter Thiel. He co-founded PayPal with Elon Musk, and he's a really brilliant thought leader in this area of change. And he talks about, he kind of divides change into two parts. He talks about things that are physical that have changed. Everything basically in this room is made of atoms, so that's what I'm talking about in the physical world. And then there's the digital world. In the digital world, which is governed by computers, there's a guy named Gordon Moore, co-founded Intel in 1965. He predicted that for the next 10 years, that computers would double in speed, and they would roughly every 18 months, and they would cost half as much. And his prediction actually turned out to be correct. And what happened is, by that prediction, if you do the math for 10 years, that's actually 100x improvement in the speed of computers, which already passes up the physical world of travel, 100x speed in computers in 10 years. But he was pretty prescient when he said that, because what became known as Moore's Law continued for another 40 years. And so computers have continued to double at a rate every 18 months to 2 years, such that now computers, and a standalone computer, is on average 100 million times faster than a computer in 1965. And that is exponentially magnified when you look at the software that we now have that hooks these computers together and has that interconnectivity. Basically, computers today are infinitely more powerful than the computers we had in 1965. That opens up some interesting opportunities. One of the things that's interesting as far as when you look at change, and I think most of us are concerned about what change can do to us, because change can disrupt our industry. And one of the ways that you can assess the potential for change to disrupt what you're doing is when something that's done currently in the physical world jumps across to the digital world, there's this huge increase in the rate of speed that it can happen. And so if you think logically about this, I know a lot of us were probably surprised at how quickly Uber and Lyft came on the market, and it completely disrupted the taxi industry. But if you just use this thinking model to evaluate that, the analog signal of raising your hand to wave down a taxi jumped across to the digital world of holding out my smartphone and clicking, I want a taxi ride, right? So we moved from the physical world to the digital world and increased the disruption of the taxi industry. 2007 is a pretty special year in the digital world. That is when the iPhone was released. Facebook became mainstream, it came out of the colleges and the high schools, and PayPal actually started in the early 2000s. And so that facilitated, secure payments. The 5-star rating system was kind of popularized by some apps. With the iPhone being out and pushing the state of the art with the smartphones, the whole app world started up. Keep in mind, 2007 was only 13 years ago. And keep in mind, things like Airbnb that started in 2008 and now has more lodging than all other hotels combined could not have started until 2008. So these changes are not things that we could have even learned about in our school systems. In fact, the school systems are so far behind this. And so we have to continually be learning how to incorporate this change into our everyday lives. A guy named Astro Teller is the leading research guy at Google. He's in charge of keeping Google on the cutting edge of technology, right? And his great-grandfather was actually the guy that kind of oversaw some of the Manhattan Project that happened in our city with regards to building the nuclear weapons. So Astro Teller is a very intelligent human being, and he drew this chart recently. He said, technology is on this exponential curve, and the problem is that our human adaptability is on a slight curve, but it's a much less steep curve. It's almost a line. He said humans adapt to change linearly, whereas technology is changing exponentially. He said somewhere between the year 2007, which is when the iPhone came out, and the year 2016, those lines crossed. We can no longer keep up with the change that is coming at us. He said that number of having to adapt to significant change has reduced from 500 years ago. It took about 100 years before significant change would happen that humans would need to adapt. By the time of the 20th century, 1900 rolled, he said it would take 20 to 30 years for humans to have to adapt to a major change. He now says 5 to 7 years, major change is happening, and we need to be adapting to it in real time. The way he illustrates real time is kind of dear to my heart. He uses a bicycle analogy, and I'm kind of gotten into road biking in the last 3 years, and that's kind of my athletic form now. It's something you can do when you're my age. It doesn't hurt your knees. But he talks about the importance of when you ride a bike, and this is not news to anybody, when you ride a bike, you've got to stay in motion, right? It's very hard to stand up on a bike if you're not in motion. And he said, we now have to assume a state of perpetual motion with regards to keeping in touch with the latest changes and incorporating those into our industry. Our ability to incorporate change is largely based on how we interact with change, how we address change, and our mindset is largely what drives that. We have a long history in this nation of scarcity. We're, for many years, largely an agricultural economy, and it's very difficult to multiply your wealth when you're basically on a farm and you're just doing ag, the old school way. Recent technology that has come about is really recent history. Is the first chance that just the average person could really multiply their wealth. And so there's a lot of huge opportunities regarding incorporating technology, but it has to come with an abundance mindset. I want to talk a little about our industry. We have a metric in the industry that we largely reference called market share. I think most of us are familiar with that. This number at the top, the 13,600, represents a number that I was given kind of as the high water mark for our industry, for kind of where we've gotten. Now, I realize that we're in here talking about towed sports, towed water sports, and I realize there's a lot, there's pontoons and there's jet boats and others that are not included in this number, but I kind of want to just use this number as a point of reference, if you'll work with me on this. When we talk about market share, we talk about in percentages typically. So if I've got a 1% market share at a number of 13,600, what would that be? Anybody? 136, right? Take the 2 zeros off, get to 136. If I gain 1% market share and that number at the top does not change, what has to happen? Somebody else has to lose part of the market share, right? So this market share model is considered, a scarcity-based model. It's kind of zero-sum thinking. The top number's fixed, and we're dividing up the market share. I know that there's 200-something people in this room, and I looked at the attendee list, and we represent a very wide, diverse sector of the industry. There's probably 12 different subgroups in this room, everybody from media to OEMs to suppliers to dealers to the industry representatives, just on and on, insurance guys, legal people. Everybody here is here for the purpose of supporting and growing the industry, right? We're talking about that, growing the industry. Larry and Kevin have done a great job over these last decade and a half, 2 decades, of building up this organization in a way that has encouraged a very wide and diverse group of participation. And so the interesting thing is, with all this new technology, we have the opportunity to really engage our customers at a new level. We have the opportunity to really give customers exposure in new ways because of social media and because of what happened in 2007 with the introduction of some of that technology. The problem is when we focus on market share, the problem is I was actually, just as an example, I was at the Porsche Experience Center a couple weeks ago. Andrew, Matt, and I went down there because we're kind of looking at Porsche as a pretty progressive company that's done some really cool stuff outside of the marine industry, obviously, just to get some ideas about how to engage customers. They have these experience centers down there where you can pay to go drive a Porsche on one of their on all of their test tracks. They have 6 different test tracks. The one I was most intrigued with was the drift track, which was polished concrete, big circle, and I really, we got to try all the tracks out, but when I got on the drift track, I think I about made my coach sick trying to get 360 around the drift track with that Porsche. And I was really having trouble spinning out, and he said, dude, you're gonna have to chill out a little bit, you're gonna have to calm down. He said something about type A personality, and I said, do you really think I'm type A? He said, oh, yeah. So anyway, we had spent 20, 30 minutes trying to get around this track, and so he finally just said, look, he said, do you ski? And I said, yeah, a little bit. And he said, do you ski through trees? I said, well, sometimes. He said, what do you look at? And I said, well, I know I'm not supposed to look at the trees. I'm supposed to look at the path between the trees. He said, exactly. He said, whatever you look at, that's the way you're going to go. And I was turning my head, and the back of the car was spinning around because it was drifting toward the grass. And he said if we went in the grass, we had to take the car back in for inspection. I knew that would be very embarrassing, so I was trying to keep the car out of the grass, but I was reacting, and I wasn't focusing on where I was needing to go. The problem with a focus just on market share, and I understand I'm not dogging that metric, I understand it's a metric we have to track, but the downside of just focusing on market share is that we're dealing in what's called the red ocean. And there's a book called Blue Ocean Strategy that talks about getting out expanding your horizons out beyond the bloody ocean of competition. And if we play just in this little market share pie, we're going to spend all of our time beating each other up on features and benefits and not looking at opportunities to grow outside of that. So how do we get outside of our heads to look at other industries? There's a book out now called Range, written by a guy named David Epstein, and he talks about the 10,000 hour rule. You've probably heard of it. It's cited, Tiger Woods has cited a lot. If you want to get really good at a particular discipline, you need 10,000 hours of focused practice. And he said, the problem with that theory is, and using like golf as an example, is golf is one of those sports, when you hit the ball, there's a very predictable result, right? Now, when I hit the ball, it's very unpredictable, but that has to do with the unpredictable input. If you can engage the ball with a predictable angle of attack, that ball is going to go in a pretty predictable trajectory. That is what he called a kind learning environment. And that is not the environment that we operate in the business world. He used musicians as an example. He said, musicians who play, and you probably know an example of this in your own personal lives, but musicians who play multiple instruments can generally accomplish a higher level of competence in one of those instruments because of that exposure to multiple instruments. They are observing principles across all the musical instruments, and that allows them to be more creative and innovative and improvise at a very high level when it comes to playing the one instrument that they might specialize in. This is also true of Nobel Prize-winning scientists. They have observed that Nobel Prize-winning scientists who have reached the very highest levels of academia always have an avocation that's outside of their main area of expertise where they spend time doing research or maybe just a hobby. So it's really important to get outside of our industry and look at other industries as an example. I mentioned Porsche, the Porsche Experience Center. You know, a couple things happened when I was down at Porsche. We paid for that experience, so it's a revenue stream for Porsche, right? Porsche in 1992 was on the ropes. They were just about to go out of business. They got down to a volume of 15,000 cars per year, worldwide. And they have reinvented their company. They've reinvented the operations. They've reinvented how they approach the customer. This is where the Experience Center concept came from. And they have now grown their total volume. Worldwide sales of the Porsche have grown to 300,000. So they've 20x'd the size of their company by re-engaging how they approach their customer and re-engaging how they approach their operations. You've seen Porsches on the road. They've really expanded the market. And the thing, a couple things that happened while I was down there at the Porsche Experience Center, which I think are relevant to the marine industry, is for one thing, it's definitely different than a boat demo. There was no pressure. There was no even perceived pressure that I was going to buy a Porsche, right? So I went down there for just the experience, and I paid for that. So the coach that was with me, he spent no time trying to sell me on features and benefits of that Porsche. What he wanted to sell me on was what it could do, right? So he got me over the hurdle of feeling intimidated by driving a very powerful 911 type high-performance sports car. And he made me do things, he told me to do things in that Porsche that I would have never done on my own, right? There was one stretch where he told me to slam the accelerator, go as hard as I could toward this basically block wall, and then he was going to tell me when to slam the brake on, and I was to slam it as hard as I could and stop. And we're going along, and I'm thinking, I'd tell me to stop right now, right now, right now. And so finally he'd say go, and I'd slam it. I'd wasted no time getting it. I don't know how those guys even do that. But he got me comfortable being in a Porsche, right? And so I think, most people in this room, a lot of you grew up in the industry. You grew up on the water. I think it might be fair to say you might just take it for granted at how comfortable you might feel growing up on the water. And I can say this coming from a different perspective. I didn't grow up on the water. I got up my first boat in 2008 when we started doing stuff for the marine industry, and I used it as a way to take my family out. And the one big advantage for a boat, and Andrew Jenkins and I were talking about this the other day, when you go out on a boat, and I've always had a boat that had 16-person capacity because my wife is very much a people person, and we had to invite everybody. We always had one or two families with us, and I've been on a boat every summer, every Saturday that we didn't have something else planned since 2008 with my family. There's not a single sport, whether it be own a Porsche or go play golf or do any other sport that I know of, that you can engage your family the way I engage my family on my boat. I think it's a huge value proposition that we take for granted. But there's this barrier that I would have, had I not started making parts for the marine industry, I probably would not be in a wakeboard boat. That's just the reality. I would have never been exposed. So I think there's a huge opportunity to get into this blue ocean by thinking differently about how we approach our customers. In life, there are a couple different types of games. There's a finite game, and there's an infinite game. The finite game A good example of a finite game is the game of football. In the finite game of football, you have rules, you have a way to keep score, we have a certain number of players, we have a certain time limit on the game. When the game is over, we declare a winner. Okay? And so that, and it's a voluntary game. It is what it is. In the game of life, there's also infinite games. For example, life itself is an infinite game. We don't win the game of life, right? Careers. We don't win our careers. We may win a promotion, but we don't win our careers. If we look at marriage, nobody wins at marriage, right? Now, my wife would tell you that she's winning, but she just wins most of the battles. We're still at war, I would tell you. No, I'm just kidding. My wife, she is, and she's going to get a copy of this video, so I've got to correct this. She is an awesome woman, and she has put up with me for over 30 years, and I would call that experience a journey. And we've been on this journey together. It's a very rich journey, and we've not always seen eye to eye, but we've managed to hold it together for over 30 years. And one thing that's common to all infinite games is that they are journeys. They're not events. A football game is an event. The game of business is an infinite game. And the main focus in an infinite game is playing to stay in the game. That's the whole purpose of playing an infinite game, is to stay in the game. We have to focus on that. So if you think about it, in the game of football, there's this thing called the onside kick. The onside kick, from a statistical perspective, only makes sense to ever call for an onside kick in a game where there's a predefined time limit, right? Because statistically speaking, the odds are so low of an onside kick working, you would never bring that to an infinite game. The problem is we have a lot of finite-minded business leaders who bring a finite-minded mentality to the infinite game of business. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs each started their companies with an infinite mindset. Bill Gates had the goal of putting a desktop on at every home and on a computer on every desktop and in every home. And he wanted to empower people. Steve Jobs had the goal of empowering teachers to teach. They both had an infinite mindset. Unfortunately, for Microsoft, they hired Steve Ballmer, who was a hard-charging operations guy, to lead Microsoft starting in the year 2000. Ballmer was a very finite-minded leader. His first thing to do was try to beat Apple. He put his sights on Apple and completely focused all of his efforts on trying to beat Apple. So he introduced the Zune audio player in 2006. It was feature for feature dramatically better than the iPod. The only problem was the infinite-minded Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone in 2007 and completely obsoleted both the iPod and the Zune. Steve Ballmer continued to try his reactionary defensive strategy against competing players when he introduced Bing to compete with Google. Bing's less than 5% market share to Google's over 90% market share. He teamed with Nokia to try to develop a phone to compete with Android and iPhone, to no avail. He tried to come out with a tablet to compete with the iPad. That didn't work out really well. Simon Sinek said Simon Sinek is the author of Find Your Why. And he spoke at 2 educational conferences, one for Microsoft and one for Apple. He said when he went to the Microsoft conference, every speaker at the Microsoft conference talked about how they were going to beat Apple. He said everybody that spoke at the Apple conference talked about how they were going to empower teachers. Steve Ballmer was very frustrated with the situation when he retired in 2013 that the iPhone had been so successful. He had actually predicted the iPhone would never gain more than 2 to 3% market share. And so he was obviously very upset. And so he was trying to, at his retirement speech, or as he stepped down, he's trying to defend this. He said, Apple has probably made more than we have in the last 5 years. He said, but we've made more than all other